Here we are back again with another video for POD. So today we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday by talking about political parties and really by finishing how we got to the two-party system that we currently have. So yesterday we talked about Thomas Jefferson, we talked about Alexander Hamilton, and how we had the Democratic Republican Party and the Federalist Party. Now, in 1800, when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr win the presidency and the vice presidency, the Federalists kind of go to the wayside, especially after the War of 1812. They were really just looked at as like the losing party, and the Democrats were the ones in power. So that's known as the era of good feelings, where there's just one political party. But as you can probably imagine, just having one political party is not going to be a good thing. So because of that, in 1824, we start to see sectional division. And what I mean by that, sectional, it's talking about how you have different candidates who are just running a campaign for 3 or 4 states. Because the United States is so small at this time, you could potentially be successful that way. But really what happens in 1824 is it just becomes a nightmare, a disaster for the Electoral College, and creates the two-party system. So I think the best way to explain it is by showing you this map here. So this is an electoral map that we see in every election since George Washington. So the top, 1824, the right is going to be your key. So we have electoral votes, we have popular votes, and then we have the people who are running. Now, when we see like 2016, we see basically the two major candidates. We saw Donald Trump, we saw Hillary Clinton. Now, it's interesting, or it's good to note that there's 4 different people running a sectional campaign. Now, Clay, for example, he wins kind of these middle states here. Jackson, he wins the South. Adams, he wins the North. So because of that idea of kind of running these sectional campaigns, the election of 1824 essentially sets up the two-party system that we have today. So what happens in this election is it's contested. There isn't a winner in the Electoral College. So you'll note here, by looking at the key, that Andrew Jackson, he had 38% of the electoral votes, or 99, and he needed to have over 50%. So today it's 270. That's why it's 270 to win. But because he doesn't have the requisite 50 plus 1, he is not going to be seen as the winner. And the Constitution dictates whenever there isn't a clear winner in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives, they get to decide who the winner is going to be. So what they do is they pick the top 3 candidates. So they go with Adams, Jackson, and Crawford. Clay, because he took 4th, he essentially gets kicked out. But it's important to know what his next role is going to be. So when it goes to the House of Representatives, Jackson just automatically believes that he should be the one that automatically wins, because he had the popular vote, he had the most electoral votes. But the House, they get to do whatever they want to. They get to vote however they want to. So because of that, they end up voting for John Quincy Adams. So he becomes the president in 1824, and Andrew Jackson, he cries foul. He calls it the corrupt bargain, which I really don't believe too much, because John Quincy Adams was a person who was pretty much uncorruptible. He did whatever he thought was best, and he didn't really care about money. But anyway, so he is going to call corrupt bargain because the leader or the Speaker of the House is Henry Clay. This individual right here. So what happens after John Quincy Adams is elected, Henry Clay gets a very, very high position in the cabinet, and it was kind of seen as like the stepping stone for the presidency. Now, Jackson, as I said, he cries foul, he calls it the corrupt bargain, and what he does next is start his own political party. So this was the time period where it was just the Democratic Republicans. Andrew Jackson is the modern-day creator of the Democratic Party. And for him, I can't remember exactly the quote, but it was something along the lines of, "I swear to God, I will never see John Quincy Adams win re-election." So, I mean, that doesn't mean he thought he was going to die. He was willing to do absolutely anything he could to prevent Adams from winning in 1828. And then in 1828, Andrew Jackson wins, and then we get the two-party system. So that's where we get to the third bullet point, where it says the Democratic Party then competing with the Whigs. So really, once that happens, that sets up our two-party system. Yes, we started with the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, but that was really short-lived. So in 1828, we have the Democratic Party versus the Whigs, and then we really see that sectional conflict, where we really see that North versus the South. And, really the reason that we see the South winning these presidencies and winning these very high up positions is because of the 3/5 compromise. And again, what that refers to is that every 5 enslaved people would count as 3 citizens. So what that does is that gives a lot of extra votes for the South. I mean, even so much so, that was the only reason that Thomas Jefferson won in 1800. Without it, John Adams would have won re-election. But regardless, we start to see kind of this North versus the South, and once that happens, we start to see really a big conflict brewing. And because of that, because there was the Democratic Party in the South, and there really wasn't a leading cohesive coalition in the North, we get the formation of the Republican Party. So the Republican Party, they form in 1854. And there's a couple of different resources that say where they were founded. Some say Wisconsin, some say Michigan. But as you all know, I'm from Wisconsin, so there's absolutely no way I'm giving Michigan any credit. So the Republican Party was formed in 1854 in Ripon, Wisconsin. And they were a coalition between really just all sorts of political parties. We had members of the Whigs forming. There was members of the Free Soilers. Free Soilers were people who were very anti-slavery. We had a group called the Know-Nothings, which to me is just the worst example of a political party. Yesterday we talked about political parties as this group with the intention of trying to win and gain power. Well, they were a secret political party, and if anybody ever asked the people in that party what they knew about it, their response was, "I know nothing." So again, why do you form? How do you get power if you are a secret group? I don't know. You eventually just join with the Republican Party. So in 1854, they run their first candidates. 1856, they run their first candidate for president. And in 1860, the first Republican wins, which is Abraham Lincoln. And we know once he is elected president, really what happens at that point when you have the actual issue of the North versus the South, and we get the actual war. So that sets up our two-party system. But we do have third parties in the United States. Now, third parties have competed in our two-party system. It's just we discussed that the biggest thing you need to be able to get into politics is money. And third parties, they lack the finances. They lack the resources that the Republicans and the Democrats have. I mean, there is just so much money that goes into winning an election, and the Republicans and Democrats have established those campaigns for quite some time. But, there are some examples of third parties having some success. So we'll end on the 2 examples that I can think of. We have, first one, the Populist Party. Now, the Populist Party, they called for direct election of senators, and they called for an 8-hour workday. And as we know, we don't really have a major following of the Populist Party, but what we do have is their goals. We have direct election of senators. We have an 8-hour workday. Now, depending on where you work, and I know a lot of people in this community in Beulah, they work shift work and have 12-hour shifts, or some people are ranchers, and some days they work a lot more than 8 hours, some days a little bit less than 8 hours. But overall, when we talked about the white-collar workers, that is going to be kind of the 8-hour workday. So, that's how third parties have influenced politics. That's one example. And then the last example I'll go through is the Progressive Party. Now, the Progressive Party, they formed in the 1920s. They were this kind of anti-founding father group that wanted to put their own twist and their own spin on the Constitution. And more importantly, when I say that, is they didn't think that the Constitution had evolved from 1789 to 1920 when they actually began. So because of that, they had three major beliefs, or three major things they fought for in politics. We have the direct primary, the initiative, and the referendum. Now, the direct primary, we discussed that in the video that we watched yesterday. That's where each of the candidates basically go state by state in an attempt to try to get delegates so they can get to the national convention, so they can become the nominee for president. And each state is a little bit different, the way that those are going to be run. But overall, the direct primary gives it so there's more democracy. There is more voting. And whether or not you think that that's a good thing, I'll give you my own opinion on a little bit later. But overall, that's what the direct primary does. We also have an initiative. An initiative is a law that a citizen can attempt to get passed and put on the ballot by petition. So an example of that was the issue of marijuana in the state of North Dakota. That was something that was voted on 2 years ago. That was something that was an initiative. Once enough people sign it, it then goes on the ballot. Once it's on the ballot, then the state decides whether or not it should become law. And the last thing we'll talk about is a referendum. And the most recent referendum that I can think of, and most of you would remember, is going to be the Beulah School Project. I know we see the construction that's going on, but before they got to that construction, it was a big issue on whether or not taxes were going to be too high, whether or not the school was going to be too expensive. So instead of just saying, yep, we'll build a $400 million school, which it was nowhere close to $400 million. I'm just using that as a really bad example. Instead of just making the taxpayers pay that, a referendum allows them to vote yes or no on it. So really all these things give for more democracy, which is really something that in 1789 they never would have fought for. So that's why the progressives put their own spin on it, and we start to see these third party forming.